My name is Ted Clement, and I'm the Executive Director of Save Mount Diablo, and welcome to our Nature Heals and Inspires Zoom series. Understanding that nature is the ultimate foundation for our long-term health and well-being, which is of course especially important in a crisis period, we developed our free public education Zoom series, Nature Heals and Inspires, to help our communities understand that nature is a critical part of the solution to working through these very difficult times we find ourselves. The series started in April, and to date, we have delivered 11 presentations to our communities by an amazing and diverse group of experts. We've had ecotherapists present, we've had conservationists present incredible aspects of the natural world to inspire people to get outside. We had one of the world's leading authorities on the cross-cultural traditions of sacred mountains present. We had the San Francisco Bay Area's leading natural landscape photographer share his incredible nature images with our supporters. We had a personal trainer present and teach people how he uses nature to help his clients get stronger physically, emotionally, mentally. We're looking to do at least one presentation a month in our Nature Heals and Inspires Zoom series. And you can go to our website for more information about that. So be on the lookout for future presentations. Today, we truly have a special gift of gratitude and inspiration for you, our supporters. This afternoon Zoom presentation entitled Taking Pictures and Saving Land by Scott Hein. Scott is an incredible individual that I've had the pleasure of working with about 5 years now. He's a scientist, he's a small business owner, a terrific and long-serving Save Mount Diablo board member, a naturalist, and an active freelance nature and conservation photographer. Photographers like Ansel Adams, Stephen Joseph, and Scott Hein have been an important part of the history of conservation in our country and for Save Mount Diablo. Their stunning photos have helped inspire people to take action on conservation and get outdoors to enjoy all this natural beauty. Today, Scott will kindly help us better understand and appreciate this important tradition in the conservation arena. He will also share inspiring nature photos with all of us. Scott, I just want to thank you for all of your great work, your support of Save Mount Diablo for so many years. And I should mention Scott's incredible wife, Claudia Hein, who is also just doing so much great stuff on behalf of Save Mount Diablo and conserving nature in our area. And Scott, please take it away. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ted. I appreciate the introduction, and I really appreciate everyone who's joined in this afternoon. We were talking before you all joined in how strange it is giving a presentation to a room full of virtual people, but I really appreciate it. Before I jump into my presentation on conservation photography, I thought I would give a very quick introduction to Save Mount Diablo for those of you who might not be familiar with the organization. Save Mount Diablo was founded in 1971 by Dr. Mary Bowerman and Art Bonwell to protect Mount Diablo and the surrounding wildlands. We are a nationally accredited land trust. Our mantra is preserve, defend, restore, and enjoy. We preserve land by either purchasing it outright or by extinguishing development rights through purchase of perpetual conservation easement. We defend land through land use advocacy and remaining involved and vigilant in the public policy-making process. Once we own land, we restore it through the efforts of our stewardship staff, stewardship committee, and a large number of very committed volunteers. This may involve cleanup of ranch dump sites, removal of fencing, removal of invasive species, native plant restoration, and building new trails when and where that's appropriate. Finally, we help the public enjoy the protected lands through programs like our Discover Diablo hiking series. So how have we done? In 1971, when the organization was formed, there were just under 7,000 acres of protected land in our area of parkland in our area of interest, most of it around the main peak of Mount Diablo extending down into the Rock City area. Today, through the efforts of Save Mount Diablo and important allies like the East Bay Regional Park District, in the California Department of Parks and Rec, there are well over 110,000 acres of parks and protected open space in our area of interest. Excuse me for a second here, I lost my control. So 110,000 acres of park and protected open space. However, there's still a lot of work to do. You can see the large donut hole here in the middle of our area of unprotected land in Morgan Territory in the Marsh Creek Corridor area. We also recently expanded our area of interest south to include more of the northern part of the Diablo Range down here. Mount Diablo is at the head of the 150-mile-long Diablo Range, which extends south all the way into Kern County, down here, the northwestern corner of Kern County. We want to make sure that Mount Diablo never gets cut off from the rest of the Diablo Range. And as part of our initial investigations, we created the first ever inventory and map of the conserved land of the Diablo Range that you see here. We believe the protection of the Diablo Range will be the next great California conservation story. So moving into conservation photography and my presentation, this will be a very brief history of conservation photography, and then moving into the conservation photographers that have helped us out over the years and the impact that has been made. So what is conservation photography? Well, here are a couple of different definitions. The first one by Alexandra Garcia: conservation photography is about inspiring thoughtful action with the goal of achieving real and tangible conservation goals. That's a very nice, pleasant definition of conservation photography. Here's a second one by Joel Sartore. The typical nature photograph shows a butterfly on a pretty flower. The conservation photograph shows the same thing, but with a bulldozer coming at it in the background. A somewhat darker description of what conservation photography entails. In reality, you need both the beautiful and compelling imagery that show what's at stake and inspires people, but also the images that illustrate the threats. So heading into the brief history of conservation photography, I'm going to discuss the very beginnings of conservation photography with Carleton Watkins, the birth of modern conservation photography with David Brower and the Sierra Club, and today the International League of Conservation Photographers. Now let me start by saying that I could easily spend the entire afternoon telling you about Carleton Watkins alone and not even get to other conservation photographers, but sadly I only have time for a quick introduction. Carleton Watkins was a San Francisco photographer who in 1861, as the Civil War was starting, loaded up a couple thousand pounds of photography equipment and made the long journey to Yosemite. On that trip, he captured what are arguably some of the most important conservation photographs ever. He had built his own camera for this trip because he felt that the conventional cameras and glass plates of the day were too small to do justice to the dramatic Yosemite landscapes. So he designed and built a camera for what he called Mammoth, and these were 18 by 22 inch glass plates, which were huge for the day. After that trip, he made mammoth prints from the glass plates, and those were sent to Washington, D.C. to help Congress and President Lincoln to pass legislation to preserve Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove. That legislation was passed in 1864 and was the first time public lands were protected purely for the enjoyment of the public. This effort was the genesis of what would become America's best idea, national parks. Carleton Watkins is really one of the unsung heroes of conservation, and I encourage you to read the recent biography by Tyler Green to learn more about him. He's someone that a lot of people haven't heard about. We'll skip ahead 100 years now. David Brower was a climber and a photographer who in 1952 became the first executive director of the Sierra Club. Concerned about threats to the Sierra and other public lands that he loved, he started the Sierra Club toward becoming the environmental advocacy organization it is today. Brower was also a genius at messaging, and he realized that combining beautiful imagery with great storytelling would be stronger than either alone. And as a result, he pioneered the idea of using what we now call coffee table books as a tool for environmental advocacy. The first of these books, published in 1955, This is Dinosaur, was a response to a proposal by the federal government to build 2 dams in Utah's Dinosaur National Monument, which would have flooded a place called Echo Park. Worried that this place would be destroyed because the public simply didn't know about it, he sent photographers Phillip, Hyde, and Martin Lytton there to capture photographs and recruited Wallace Stegner to edit the book. When it was completed, the book was sent to all members of Congress and was instrumental in preventing the 2 dams from being built. This is Dinosaur was the genesis of the Sierra Club's wildly successful but also very expensive exhibit format books, which are sometimes also referred to as their battle books, because they were used when battling environmental dangers. These books, with photos by Ansel Adams, Eliot Porter, Phillip Hyde, and others, and text by authors like Henry David Thoreau and Edward Abbey, were used to raise environmental awareness and to advocate for land conservation and the creation of new national parks, including Point Reyes National Seashore locally. They also led, arguably, at least in part, to the ouster of David Brower as the executive director of the Sierra Club, but that's a story for another day. Moving to the present, the technologies today that are available to the conservation photographer are pretty incredible. And social media allows us to get our photographs and stories out to the public quickly. However, with climate change, habitat destruction, and all the other threats facing the Earth, the need for conservation photography is as great as ever. The International League of Conservation Photographers was formed in 2005 to support the important work of leading conservation photographers. I don't have time to mention all of these amazing photographers individually, but I'd like to tell you about a couple who have had an impact on me personally. The first one is Tom Mangelsen. And he's a photographer who has been featured on 60 Minutes. You may have seen that segment. And you know, when someone is featured on 60 Minutes, they either have done something really, really good or really, really bad. And Mangelsen has done some great work through his conservation photography. When we first moved to California in the late 1980s, there was a large exhibit of his photos in the Oakland airport that I would stop and admire every time I passed through. Those photos, and particularly the iconic photo of the Alaskan brown bear that he captured moments before the salmon, before it closed its jaws on the migrating salmon, just blew my mind, and it encouraged me to start thinking more about wildlife photography in particular, and it became a spark that would soon become a flame for me. And if you want to learn more about Mangelsen, his website is www.mangelsen.com. Another photographer that has inspired me is Joel Sartore and his photo arc project, which has also been featured on 60 Minutes. His goal is to photograph as many of the species of the world as possible. The photos take the form of simple portraits with solid backgrounds to remove distractions. I checked this morning, and he's now photographed over 10,531 species around the world so far, including many critically endangered species like this 6-day-old Malayan tapir. The hope is that the public will connect with these species through these portraits and advocate for their protection. When I first saw this photo, again, my brain exploded. I had no idea. I'd never seen this animal before, and I immediately did a deep dive into the Photo Arc website, and I would encourage you all to do the same. And his website is www.joelsartore.com and photo-arc for the Photo Arc website. This is another one of his photos, and this is from the exotic to the seemingly mundane. This is a Colombian basin pygmy rabbit that he photographed in 2007. She was one of 2 individuals of this race of pygmy rabbit alive at the time, and unfortunately they were both females. So when she died in 2008, it was the end of this genetic line. And I have to say, I love this photograph. Nature and wildlife photographers often try to capture photographs of perfect specimens, which she is most definitely not. She has half an ear, her nose is crooked, and her eyes have the look of an old soul. However, I find it to be an extremely compelling portrait that expresses her situation poignantly. Now let's talk about some of Save Mount Diablo's conservation photographers, get a little closer to home here. Save Mount Diablo has long recognized the importance of photographs in communicating the importance of our work. This photograph of a development being built in Danville is titled Matchstick Houses, and it was taken by photographer Bob Walker in 1989. The hills behind this development up here were protected as a condition of the development approval and are now the Sycamore Valley Open Space Regional Preserve. Moving forward to the present, the Sycamore Valley Open Space Regional Preserve will connect with the newly protected lands of the McGee Preserve, which Save Mount Diablo was instrumental in helping to protect. And this is a map of the McGee Ranch property here in the protected lands of the McGee Preserve. And about 93% of the McGee Ranch was protected as a condition for the development of a number of houses down here in the lower flat area. And this is the Sycamore Valley open space that was shown in that Matchstick Houses photo. So connections through the years and through the open space lands. And the photographer who took that Matchstick Houses photo was Bob Walker, as I mentioned. And from the time he picked up a camera and began photographing the open spaces of the East Bay in 1982 until his death 10 years later, he became one of our most important conservation photographers and environmental advocates. If you love Morgan Territory Regional Preserve like I do, you owe a great deal of thanks to Bob Walker. He lobbied the Park District tirelessly to expand this park, and his efforts really paid off over time. It's one of our most fabulous regional parks in the area. Bob also served on the board of Save Mount Diablo and was responsible for introducing a young environmentalist named Seth Adams to Bob Doyle when Save Mount Diablo was hiring its first paid staff in 1988. And as they say, the rest is history. After Walker passed away in 1992, the Park District named the beautiful Oak Top Ridge in Morgan Territory that rises above what is now Round Valley Regional Preserve as Bob Walker Ridge. Bob Walker embraced environmental advocacy and had tremendous impact as a conservation photographer. His work was commemorated in the 2007 book, After the Storm, shown here. And this is a self-portrait that Bob Walker took of himself on lands that are now part of Morgan Territory Regional Preserve. In the early 1990s, right around the time that Bob Walker became ill and could no longer take on photography projects for Save Mount Diablo, another photographer appeared on the scene. Stephen Joseph met with Seth Adams, handed him a postcard with a small version of one of his spectacular panoramic photos, and offered to volunteer his skills for Save Mount Diablo. As many of you may know, Stephen has assembled the finest collection of images of the mountain and has generously allowed them to be used by Save Mount Diablo and other conservation organizations. Late last year, he self-published his second book of Mount Diablo images titled Mount Diablo, A Story of Place and Inspiration. Stephen's website is www.stephenjosephphoto.com. In addition to Stephen's photos, his new book includes chapters written by Stephen himself, his co-author Linda Kohlberg, Save Mount Diablo board member Bob Marks, Land Conservation Director Seth Adams, Executive Director Ted Clement, East Bay Regional Park District General Manager Bob Doyle, and Edwin Birnbaum, author of Sacred Mountains of the World. So it's also a good resource for anyone who cares about the mountain. There have been many other photographers who have engaged with Save Mount Diablo over the years for specific projects or for short periods of time and helped us advance our conservation mission. For example, Galen Rowell and Michael Sewell included photographs of Mount Diablo in an interview with Mary Bowerman in their 1997 book, Bay Area Wild. This book was published by the Sierra Club with a foreword by David Brower. Rowell also helped to document the reintroduction of peregrine falcons to Castle Rock Regional Park. I'd like to commit the rest of this presentation to discussing my path to conservation photography with Save Mount Diablo and give you highlights of some of the interesting projects I've been able to work on. My involvement with Save Mount Diablo began when my wife Claudia, who is out there in Zoomland somewhere. Well, actually, she's in the kitchen right next to me, and this is a very weird time. She started volunteering in the Save Mount Diablo office around 2000 or 2001. And at the time, the Save Mount Diablo staff consisted of Seth Adams, our first full-time paid staff member, Ron Brown, who had just been hired as the executive director, and we had a part-time administrator. So a very much leaner organization than we are now. At some point, Claudia mentioned to Seth that I was a photographer and showed him the photo of Snowy North Peak you see here that I had just taken in February of 2001. At the time, Stephen Joseph was getting busy with his own photography business, and he had retired from the Save Mount Diablo board of directors. So Seth was looking for other photographers to help the organization. He was intrigued and started feeding me photography projects to see what I could do. Before I continue with the Save Mount Diablo story, I should probably step back and give you some background on my approach to photography and how it's evolved. I had always been interested in photography, and in fact had thought briefly about studying photojournalism in college. When Claudia and I moved to Concord in the fall of 1988, we started exploring the natural places of the Bay Area, Mount Diablo, of course, but also places like Point Reyes. On one of those trips, we took a field seminar that was led by a naturalist named Rich Stallcup. Rich was one of the founders of the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, which is now called Point Blue. And we quickly became friends, and he became a mentor on all things nature. Although he was best known for his knowledge of birds, he was interested in everything, and he passed along that passion to everyone who spent time with him. As we learned about the natural history of California, my interest in photography was sparked again. I wanted to be able to capture photos of the beautiful things I was seeing in the field. So my approach to nature photography has evolved from the point of view of a naturalist. And as a result, I spend as much time as I can with other scientists and naturalists to learn as much as I can about their areas of specialty. I believe the best way to become a better nature photographer is to become a better naturalist. Unfortunately, Rich passed away in 2012, but his legacy lives on. Another thing I've learned is that for your photographs to have the greatest impact, you need to collaborate with great storytellers, and SMD, Save Mount Diablo, has one of the best in Seth Adams. As I mentioned earlier, in the beginning, Seth would send me out to capture specific photographs to help complement the stories he was writing for our newsletter called Diablo Watch, for campaigns he was working on, or for other various purposes. Since then, we've worked together on so many Save Mount Diablo projects for so many years that he can just generally give me an overview and I can bring back the photos he needs. Another great storyteller I've worked with more recently is Joan Hamilton, whose Audible guides have become an important educational and documentary resource for Save Mount Diablo and other local organizations like the Mount Diablo Interpretive Association. I'll mention a little bit more about Audible guides later. On one of my first projects for Save Mount Diablo, I took this photo from Highland Ridge. The East Bay Regional Park District was purchasing several properties in this area to add to Morgan Territory Regional Preserve, and we needed photos to help with the announcements. Now, this isn't a particularly great photo, but it is significant in that it was one of the last photos I took for Save Mount Diablo, and in fact for anyone, using a film camera. I quickly discovered that Seth wanted copies of all the photos that I took, not just the beautiful ones. He told me that you never know when a particular photo will be important in the future, and that has borne out over the years. In the few short months that I'd been working with Seth and taking photos for the organization, I'd become overwhelmed. First, trying to make slide duplicates, which became expensive. So I purchased a slide scanner, but that's also a tedious and slow process. I hadn't planned to switch to digital photography, but in the fall of 2001, I bought my first digital camera body, primarily to accommodate Seth's request for photos. And after I bought that digital camera body, I think I took 3 more rolls of film. So I adapted to the digital world pretty quickly. What I'd like to do now is look back over some of the more important or interesting projects I've worked on with Save Mount Diablo over the years. The first one I call Revenge of the Red-Legged Frog. In 2002, developer Albert Sino had been convicted of what's called a taking under the Endangered Species Act. A pond containing California red-legged frogs had been bulldozed at one of his development projects. He was ordered to pay a fine of $1 million, but Save Mount Diablo didn't think that would be enough of a deterrent for someone as wealthy as he was. We suggested that he should be forced to protect his square-mile hunting ranch located in Morgan Territory by placing a conservation easement on it. This photo of Mount Diablo I took from that ranch while Seth and I toured the property with California Department of Fish and Wildlife personnel. My photos from this tour were included in the baseline documents for the conservation easement. But the story doesn't end there. You can see in this small snippet of a map, Morgan Territory Ranch, which is the Sino hunting ranch. And it turns out that the only way for Mr. Sino to access the ranch is through a small property down here called Red Corral, this little triangle piece of property off Morgan Territory Road. Save Mount Diablo received $350,000 of the $1 million fine to be used for protection of red-legged frog habitat. We used that money to purchase the Morgan Red Corral property pictured here. So the only way for Mr. Sino to access his now protected hunting ranch was through a property owned by Save Mount Diablo. The Red Corral property has since been transferred to Mount Diablo State Park and is part of Mount Diablo State Park. Unfortunately, this isn't the last time you'll hear the Sino name in my presentation. In 2005, Seth called me at work and asked if I could get away to photograph an extinct wildflower. As you can probably guess, I said, no, I'm too busy, Seth, I can't do that. And of course not, I jumped at the chance. The Mount Diablo buckwheat had been last seen by Save Mount Diablo founder Dr. Mary Bowerman in 1936 and was presumed to be extinct. Then in 2005, graduate student Mike Park discovered a small population growing in Mount Diablo State Park. The Mount Diablo buckwheat rediscovery occurred right around the same time that there was talk that the ivory-billed woodpecker had been rediscovered. So there was widespread excitement over the idea of the rediscovery of species thought to be extinct, sometimes called Lazarus species. When we announced the Mount Diablo buckwheat rediscovery in a press release, it was almost immediately picked up by the Associated Press and quickly went worldwide. We followed the news releases all over the world and all over many different publications. And it just goes to show the power of photographs in capturing in circumstances like this, capturing the public's imagination. Unfortunately, the population of Mount Diablo buckwheat at the original rediscovery site is in a really tenuous situation. There were originally only about 20 plants found at that location, and there have been no plants found in recent surveys done there. An attempt was made to reintroduce them to another nearby location, but that reintroduction was only partially successful. We did collect seeds at the original site, and those were taken to the UC Botanical Garden, and the plant was propagated there. So there is a good seed bank of the plants, but in terms of wild populations, it was tenuous. Then in 2016, botanists Heath Bartosh and Brian Peterson were doing a rare plant survey in Black Diamond Mines Regional Preserve and discovered a new population. They were walking through an area during their survey and saw some kind of a pink glow on the hill off in the distance and had no idea what it was, so went over to investigate. They discovered Mount Diablo buckwheat, but instead of 20 plants, they estimated there were 2 million plants, which is just amazing. However, this is still a very small location that could easily be impacted, but fortunately it's on the protected land of Black Diamond Mines Regional Preserve. So the Mount Diablo buckwheat can breathe a little bit easier. Now, one thing you learn when you're involved in land conservation for any length of time is that you really have to take the long view. Rarely are issues settled quickly, and it can take years and sometimes even decades to achieve your conservation goals. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some of these long-term issues I've been involved with, where I haven't in my photography have been involved with. The first one is in Antioch. In 2002, the city of Antioch was proposing a development plan on its southern boundary called Future Urban Area Number 1, or FUA1. The westernmost property in FUA1 is called the Higgins Ranch, which is bordered on 3 sides by Black Diamond Mines Regional Preserve. The fence you see in this photograph is the boundary between Black Diamond Mines and the Higgins Ranch. And this is in a fairly isolated part of Black Diamond Mines Regional Preserve. Imagine houses backing up on the fence line here. We led several hikes to educate the public about what was at stake, and I spent quite a bit of time on my own exploring and photographing the area. And this turned out to be one of the first times I realized the power that my photographs in particular might have in land use advocacy, when I was accused by development proponents in a local newspaper of doctoring my photos. They said that the photos were too beautiful to be real. So I took that as a compliment, I guess. But of course I hadn't doctored them. But I realized they wouldn't have made those accusations unless they thought the photos were detrimental to their efforts somehow. 16 years later, in 2018, Save Mount Diablo and allies sponsored a ballot initiative in Antioch called Let Antioch Voters Decide to protect a significant portion of the original FUA1 area, including the Higgins Ranch, and make Antioch's urban limit line permanent. The initiative was eventually adopted by the Antioch City Council. However, things got complicated when the developers with interest in the area sued, and we had to wait for the legal process to proceed. The courts determined that our initiative, instead of being adopted by the City Council, had to go to the ballot in November of 2020, November of this year. The initiative has been designated as Measure T, and we are in active campaign mode right now. So if any of you out there happen to be Antioch residents, please vote yes on Measure T. And even better yet, if anyone's interested in volunteering for a grassroots campaign, please contact Save Mount Diablo. We can use all the help we can get right now. In 2006, the City of Concord began a public process to develop a reuse plan for the 5,000-acre Concord Naval Weapons Station on its northern city limits. I was appointed by the City Council to serve on the Community Advisory Committee for the reuse plan. While I was working through the Community Advisory Committee, Save Mount Diablo helped to organize a community coalition and also worked to educate the business community and local politicians about what was at stake. And those efforts ended up paying off. The reuse plan that was eventually adopted by the City Council included over 3,500 acres of parks, greenways, and open space, including over 2,600 acres for a new regional park. Last year, 14 years after the planning process began, we celebrated the transfer of the first 2,300 acres from the Navy to the East Bay Regional Park District for the new Concord Hills Regional Park. Notice the hills in the background of this photo, the tower over the parkland. They're part of the next story. In 2008, we noticed what appeared to be illegal grading in the hills above Pittsburgh. Since we couldn't access that area from the ground, we arranged for the East Bay Regional Park District helicopter to fly me over the area to take photographs. Of course, once you've arranged for a helicopter ride around your area of interest, you photograph everything you can, and of course you give all the photos to Seth. One of the photographs was of an approved development in construction in the hills on the Pittsburgh side of the Concord Naval Weapons Station. The remaining green area above this development footprint in the photo, up here along the ridge line, is part of the 1,500 unit Faria development being proposed by a Sino-owned development company. Here's a map showing the relationship of the Faria development to the new regional park. If the project is approved by the City of Pittsburgh and built out to the boundary with Concord, houses could be visible on the ridgeline above the new regional park. Not surprisingly, Save Mount Diablo is opposing the development in its current form and is challenging the adequacy of the environmental documents. In what I would call a fairly ironic twist, the developer of Faria, again, Mr. Sino, has sued the East Bay Regional Park District, challenging the adequacy of their environmental documents for the new regional park. Clearly an intimidation tactic to try to pressure the park district into not opposing the Faria development. And that's fortunately not going to work. There are several other activities and events that have allowed me to capture photographs to help us with our conservation work. One is our property tours. Whenever Save Mount Diablo is considering acquiring a new property, we will tour that property, which typically involves members of our staff, board, and land committee, hiking as much of it as we can, often trying to hike the entire boundary to look at the boundary fencing. The photographs I take on these property tours are used to educate staff, board, donors, and funders about why the property should be protected. And this particular photo you see here is from our tour of Anderson Ranch in Morgan Territory. We ended up purchasing this property in 2017. And this one is from our land tour of Smith Canyon, which we closed escrow on earlier this year, just as the pandemic hit. In fact, some of the work needed to be done to close the property had to be done while we were in the shelter in place, under the shelter in place order. So it was even more complicated than closings usually are. Smith Canyon's a 29-acre property that's really beautiful in its own right, but it also provides us with much improved legal access to our adjacent 1,080-acre Curry Canyon Ranch property. One of my favorite events to photograph and participate in is our BioBlitz. In a BioBlitz, you try to identify as many species of plants and animals as you can on a defined geography and for a limited period of time, usually 24 hours. Save Mount Diablo held our first BioBlitz in 2007 on our Irish Canyon property. We think it may have been the first BioBlitz in the Bay Area. Every year we move the location of the BioBlitz around to properties that would benefit from additional knowledge about the biotics that are found on them. And so it's very exciting to be able to access properties and do this kind of in-depth investigation. In order for a BioBlitz to be successful, you want to attract as many scientists and naturalists from as many different disciplines as you can. This provides an amazing opportunity for someone like me to learn from those experts and also, of course, capture interesting photographs. And here are a couple. This is a night snake, and it was actually found during our Curry Canyon Ranch BioBlitz by rancher John Ginocchio on his family's land. And this is my first live sighting of this species. I had seen them in field guides, but never seen one live, and my first opportunity to photograph it, and they're a really beautiful little snake. This is a grasshopper sparrow singing from a thistle perch, also on Save Mount Diablo's Curry Canyon Ranch. And grasshopper sparrows are uncommon in our area and very unpredictable in where you find them from year to year, so you never expect to see them, and you're always pleasantly surprised when you do. So you can imagine my excitement when I found this one teed up and cooperating for a photo on one of our BioBlitzes. I took this photo of the Lime Ridge Navaretia during a BioBlitz we had on our Mangini Ranch property and also nearby Lime Ridge open space. The Lime Ridge Navaretia is a newly described plant species that was actually discovered in only 2008 by a botanist named David Goen in Lime Ridge open space. And this is for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, this is a relatively small open space park that separates suburban Walnut Creek and Concord. So think about that. In this time, finding a plant that had never been known to science before on an open space property that was protected between two of the larger cities in our county. Pretty amazing thing. And it shows one of the reasons why we do the land protection and land conservation work that we do. And then of course, there's our 4 days Diablo hiking trip. Every year we lead a group of intrepid hikers from Walnut Creek, starting in Walnut Creek, to far eastern Contra Costa County, traveling 30 or 40 miles over 4 days, totally immersing ourselves in the protected lands of the Mount Diablo region. We've been leading this trip for almost 20 years, and every year the conditions and photographic opportunities are different. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the 2020 hike due to the pandemic, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to hit the trail again with another group in 2021. And this is a photo I took on 4 days Diablo, actually on the last morning of 4 days Diablo. outside the door of my tent on Roger Epperson Ridge, which if you've never been there, you need to go. It's one of the most spectacular views of Mount Diablo that we have. And just down below to the left of where I'm taking this photograph is a backpack camp, which you can actually reserve and camp there. And if you've ever wanted to camp on a regional park, you can arrange to do that through the East Bay Regional Park District. It's just a fabulous place to camp and to hike and to photograph. As I mentioned previously, the combination of compelling photos and great storytelling is a powerful tool, but you have to find outlets for those stories. This has become somewhat easier, maybe a lot easier with social media today, but you still can't beat old-fashioned print publications, especially when beautiful photos are involved. Fortunately, in the Bay Area, we have Bay Nature magazine, which is one of our great partners. They've published stories on subjects in the Mount Diablo area ranging from fire ecology as a result of the Morgan fire to Speak of the Devil, shown here. And Speak of the Devil, the noted natural history author David Rains Wallace researched and authored the story. And it's one of the finest pieces written about Mount Diablo in recent memory. Most recently, they published a special story on the Diablo Range, which is, as I mentioned, we believe will be California's next great conservation story. And that story on the Diablo Range was in part based on a trip that the author took with a group from Save Mount Diablo doing some initial explorations of various parts of the Diablo Range. And Bay Nature magazine's website is baynature.org. And if you don't subscribe to Bay Nature, you all should. I mentioned Joan Hamilton and the Mount Diablo Audible Guides earlier in my presentation. And I'm always excited to be able to provide photos for Joan to use in these guides, in part because of the amazing job she does in preparing these and producing these, but also because it generally means that I join Joan and her husband Bruce and other naturalists out hiking in the places that I love to hike and photographing. To describe the Audible Guides, I'm going to use Joan's own words to describe them. These free multimedia tours combine lively interviews and music with the rush of wind and the chirps, howls, and growls of wildlife. Naturalists heighten visitors' appreciation of the sights and sounds at each stop, tell tales of the mountain's past, and suggest what to look for around the next bend. Photographs pop up to help identify plants and animals, perfect to prepare you for your first or even your 100th trip up the mountain. Joan just completed Morgan Territory Regional Preserve, shown here, earlier this spring. And this one is as much a documentary film as it is a simple Audible guide. I'd really encourage you to go to audiblemountdiablo.com and take a look at some of these fabulous Audible guides. They really do an amazing job of introducing you to the places that we love in the Mount Diablo region. Finally, for many years, we've published the Images of Diablo calendar. My original idea for this calendar was to make it a photographic journal of the past year and to try as best I can to match the photos to the season in which they were taken. I've actually just begun to assemble the candidate images for the 2021 calendar, which is turning out to be quite interesting because of the pandemic, fire, and all the smoke. So I have my work cut out for me on the calendar this year. So I'm going to end my presentation with this photo of early spring at Castle Rock. Claudia and I were up early to go birding with friends one winter morning when we noticed the snow from the previous night's storm was visible on distant hills. We quickly changed our plans, but it was too early to get into Mount Diablo State Park, so we headed to Borges Ranch, and I quickly hiked up to the top of a ridge in Diablo Foothills Regional Park. Just as I reached the ridge top, the sun broke through the clouds and illuminated the oak tree and green grasslands you see in the foreground. I managed to brace myself against the wind and captured a few photos before the next squall came in and blew me off the ridge. You never know when and where these opportunities will happen. You just have to be out there and be ready when they do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you for listening to my presentation. And I've left enough time for us to have some questions and answers if you have any questions.
What camera would you recommend for someone starting out with landscape photography?
So depending on how serious you want to get into photography, you're really buying into a system of camera and lenses and accessories. And right now, you can't go wrong with, I happen to shoot Nikon and I have since, for 30 years. But you can't go wrong with the Nikon system, the Canon system, and more recently, the Sony system. And from there, it just becomes a matter of how serious you are, how far you think you want to build out your system, and what kind of funds you have for doing it. But if you stick with Nikon, Sony, or Canon, you're going to be fine.
Okay, great. I did have a comment that it was so beautiful and that Aileen can't wait to see the recording and watch it all over again. So that was a really nice comment.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Let's see, from Seth. What has Save Mount Diablo meant to you, and how have your thoughts about the mountain evolved?
Oh, well, Save Mount Diablo, Claudia and I sometimes kid that Save Mount Diablo is like one of our children. But we don't have children, and so the time we might have spent raising children, we've spent spending time trying to help save Mount Diablo, and so it's really important to us. We're nature people, and when you look at the open space and the parklands that are accessible to people where we live, it's just incredible. And a lot of that it's not due only to Save Mount Diablo, but Save Mount Diablo has its fingerprints on a lot of the parklands you see, along with the East Bay Regional Park District. And so it's incredibly important to us. And in third,
I'm grateful.
Yeah.
Do you take multiple images and merge them to make the panoramic photos?
Yes, so that's with digital cameras, that's how you do panoramas. You take multiple overlapping, typically in the portrait orientation, multiple photos, and then you use software to stitch them together and make the panorama.
Mm-hmm.
You can get very sophisticated with this and use special tripod heads that are designed for this. Or if you're real careful about it, you can actually do it handheld. And in fact, most of the panoramas I take are done handheld because I'm usually out hiking somewhere, not taking my heavy tripod along with me.
You must have a steady hand. Let's see. What hints can you give an advanced beginner photographer about how to get better at taking photos?
Be out there and take photos. I mean, that's how you get better. You get out and particularly during magic hour, early in the day and late in the afternoon, in good weather, in bad weather. In fact, some of the best light and conditions for photography are when the storm is clearing and you have the dramatic clouds and the dramatic light. And so the best advice I can give to anyone, and it's advice I have to learn over and over again, is you just have to get out there and photograph. And the opportunities will come to you then, particularly with digital photography. You get the immediate feedback. You don't have to wait for film to be developed and come back to you. And so you can get immediate feedback on composition and how you handle the light and things like that. But it's really just a matter of being out there.
Let's see, there's a third Karen it's nice to see so many Karens, solidarity for Karens in the chat box. So thank you for attending. One of the Karens was asking, let's see, beautiful photos. If you want to explore volunteering, photography, and writing with Save Mount Diablo, whom would we contact? And I'm thinking you can contact us at, we have a communications mailbox. So it's communications@savemountdiablo.org. The Mount is spelled out. Here's one for Scott. Do you have a favorite Mount Diablo spring wildflower?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one because there's so many to love. It might be bitterroot, Lewisia rediviva, up on the Mary Bauman Trail around the summit. Just because they're a flower that grows out of the chert slopes on the summit, and until they bloom, you don't really notice them. They have little tubular, almost succulent leaves, but they cling tight to the rocks there. And unless you look close, you might not notice them. then they bloom and you have these beautiful creamy white flowers all over that rock slope near the summit. And I just love going up there when they're blooming. You have the Mount Diablo fairy lantern. There are just so many.
We had some kudos to you. You're doing so much for this beautiful place. And it was just a recommendation, since you have a general interest in the natural history of California, to check out Alan Schoenherr's book, A Natural History of California, which I wouldn't be surprised if you already had that one.
I do have that, but thank you, Sherry.
Yeah, see? I should have known that one. Monica's asking, what's the most difficult shot you have encountered?
On Mount Diablo or in general? In general, the most difficult shots are when I was still silly enough to go out and do pelagic bird photography, where you get on a small boat and pound through the waves in the Pacific out to a place called the Cordell Bank. And I get seasick, so I spend half the time hurling over the back of the deck, and then I have to grab my camera and try to take photos of flying birds while I'm seasick and trying to view through a small viewfinder. So from the standpoint of, in general, it would be those photographs.
Wow, that is amazing. Irving's asking, what hints can you give for taking better photos of animals?
You know, animals are tough. Wildlife photography and bird photography in general are difficult because, you know, you don't control your subjects. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I really believe the best way you become particularly a better wildlife photographer is learning more about the habits and the behavior of the animals. Learning, you know, when they're most likely to be out, you know, where you might find them, the behavior, so that you can tell when you've stressed them by getting too close and you can back off. You know, it's really a matter, and again, it's a matter of spending time with your camera out in the field and learning the spots where the wildlife shows up. And a lot of it is frankly luck. If you spend enough time, you'll encounter wildlife. This spring, I did a hike on our Curry Canyon Ranch property and was hiking up the trail by myself quietly. And that's another hint is if you want to capture photos of animals and see them, you should go by yourself quietly, because anytime there's a group, that'll be talking and the animals will be spooked. But in any case, I was hiking up a trail to in our Curry Canyon Ranch property, and a bobcat crossed right in front of me and then went up inside a bush off to the side. And I moved up very slowly and was able to get full facial photos of the bobcat peering out at me through the shrub. And it was just, you know, the luck that our paths happened to cross. I was by myself, so it didn't get as spooked as it normally might have. And then I was really careful about how I approached it, and very careful not to, you know, to sense if I was disturbing it too much and back off if necessary.
Janet's asking if you have photos of coyotes. I would think that you would. We see quite a few coyotes, and they're pretty amazing.
I do have a few. Yeah. In fact, the most interesting one was from Round Valley Regional Preserve. We were actually there during the week in the winter when there aren't many people around doing a Christmas bird count. And a coyote was up on the hillside just above us. And it was actually just wandering around amongst a herd of cattle that were up on the hillside with it. And the cattle initially weren't concerned at all about it, and then it got too close to one of them, and the cow actually chased it off the side of the hill.
Wow.
But yes, I do have a few.
I think the last question right now would be, do you have a favorite season to take pictures?
Well, springtime is obviously the time where there aren't enough hours in the day, because that's when the hills are green. The light can be dramatic with clouds and storms. You have the wildflowers. In late spring, you have nesting birds and a lot of wildlife activity. So it's probably spring, but I've really grown to enjoy photographing in the summer, and and particularly in the late afternoon magic hour with the shadows on the hills. But if I had to choose one season to live and photograph all year round, it would be springtime.
Great. One last question, the name of the ridge in the photo where you camped and you had great views.
That's called Roger Epperson Ridge. and that's on the west side of Morgan Territory Road. You can hike there. You can actually park down below where the Diablo Trail crosses Morgan Territory Road, or park at the staging area and hike over there from the staging area. And it's a beautiful hike, and that's a really beautiful beautiful place to visit and photograph.
Someone asked about if you sell your photos for fundraising. I know you have a beautiful website. We will definitely include that in the thank you email we send to everyone for your photos. That is pretty much the media you would use, right, Scott? Your website?
Yeah, through my website, and I do donate photos for fundraising. We just finished Save Mount Diablo's virtual Moonlight on the Mountain, and I had a photo puzzle I auctioned off there, as well as a metal print of my snow day on Mount Diablo that I started the presentation with. It was auctioned off.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you. Everyone, we will have this recording on our YouTube channel. We'll send the link out to everyone and include a link to Scott's website and a little bit more information about Save Mount Diablo. But I really want to thank you all for joining, and thanks Scott, who has been with Claudia, just amazing, amazing supporters of our mission. And I wish you all a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us. And thanks,
Yeah,
Scott.
thanks everyone. I really appreciate you joining us.